They are small but mighty creatures. For many years, beavers have been seen as troublemakers, often blamed for chopping down trees and flooding fields. People gave them a bad name, calling them destructive, but hidden behind that rough image is a secret strength. Beavers are natural engineers, shaping the land with nothing more than teeth, mud, and instinct. When they cut down trees, they are not simply destroying, they are building. Each trunk dragged into the water becomes part of a dam, and every dam becomes part of a living system that changes dry streams into ponds, and ponds into wetlands. These wetlands are not just homes for beavers, they are safe places for birds, fish, frogs, and countless other species. Most people don't realize that beavers also help us. A lot of the water in California does not come from snow melt, but from groundwater hidden below. Beavers recharge this water for us. Their dams slow rivers, letting the water sink into the earth like coins into a savings bank, stored for later when the land is thirsty. What looks like a mess of sticks is really a living water machine. Scientists now say that these small animals may hold part of the answer to drought, heat, and even climate change. Beavers remind us that size does not measure strength. Even the smallest builders can reshape the fate of whole landscapes. A desert on the brink, the land was dying. Once, rivers had flowed strong through the valleys of the American Southwest, feeding plants, animals, and people. But now, those rivers were gone, leaving behind only scars of cracked soil and empty channels. Rain that did fall disappeared within hours, draining away as if the ground itself refused to drink. Heat pressed down harder each year, and without water, life began to vanish. Fields withered, grasses turned brittle, and trees stood like skeletons against the horizon. Entire ecosystems that had thrived for centuries collapsed in silence. For scientists and locals alike, it felt like watching the desert swallow everything whole. Traditional solutions, big dams, irrigation systems, and retention basins offered only short and costly relief. They took years to build and millions of dollars, yet even then the water slipped away too quickly. Farmers gave up their land, ranchers thinned their herds, and wildlife either fled or died. The desert was no longer a place of survival. It was becoming a graveyard. Experts spoke of climate change and warming skies, of landscapes too broken to heal. To many, it seemed inevitable that these lands would remain barren forever. But in this moment of despair, when every known solution had failed, a small team of ecologists began to consider something unthinkable. What if the answer wasn't more concrete or machinery? What if the key to bringing water back lay in the paws of a creature most people had long ignored, or worse, despised? The desert was on the brink, and only something radical could save it. Last hope for water. When every human made fix failed, the search for answers grew desperate. Engineers had tried dams, canals, and pipelines, but the desert always won. Water slipped away and the land stayed thirsty. That was when one voice in the room suggested something that sounded almost like madness: beavers. Not as pests, not as symbols, but as workers of nature. At first, the idea sparked laughter. Beavers in a desert. How could animals known for building dams in lush forests possibly survive in dry, cracked valleys? But the more the ecologists studied, the more sense it made. For thousands of years, beavers had reshaped landscapes by slowing rivers, spreading water, and storing it underground. Native tribes once called them sacred builders, recognizing their power to summon wetlands from bare land. Early settlers wrote about valleys transformed by their ponds in a single season. Unlike machines, beavers asked for no pay and required no fuel. They worked day and night, driven only by instinct, building homes that doubled as water banks for the entire ecosystem. The team realized this might be their last chance. Instead of pouring millions into temporary fixes, why not relocate overpopulated beavers from wetter regions into dying rivers? If they survived, the animals would do the work humans could not. If they failed, little would be lost. The gamble was clear: release thousands of beavers into one of the driest landscapes in America and hope instinct would succeed where science had fallen short. It was not just a plan, it was the last hope for water. The wild beaver plan, they called it madness. Dropping thousands of dam-building beavers into one of the driest corners of America sounded more like a barroom joke than a serious project. But for the small team of ecologists staring at empty rivers and dead valleys, it was the final card left to play. From 2022 into early 2023, they began carefully relocating overpopulated beavers from northern watersheds to selected sites in the desert southwest. Each family was tagged, tracked, and monitored by biologists. The plan was simple in words, but daring in action. Let the beavers do what humans could not. No heavy machines, no concrete walls, no million-dollar projects. Just instinct, teeth, mud, and wood. At first, the results were underwhelming. The animals gnawed on cottonwoods, built small dams, and vanished into burrows. Skeptics shook their heads, certain it would end in failure. Yet slowly, the desert began to change. Small pools formed behind the modest dams. Even after seasonal rains faded, the pools remained, soaking into the banks and feeding the soil. By midsummer, channels once dry for decades held water under the sun. The ecologists realized something extraordinary was happening. Their wild plan was no longer theory, it was proof. Beavers were not only surviving, they were reshaping the desert itself. What had begun as a desperate gamble now glimmered with possibility. If a few dozen dams could hold water in a dying landscape, what could thousands of beavers achieve? The answer was about to stun everyone watching. Early signs of change, the first week showed little to celebrate, but then the desert began whispering of change. Behind the earliest dams, small pools gathered. At first, they seemed fragile, nothing more than muddy puddles. Yet as the days stretched into weeks, something remarkable happened. The water stayed. Long after the last winter rains had vanished, these pools held firm, their surfaces glimmering under the harsh desert sun. For the first time in decades, moisture lingered. Soil that had been dry and cracked softened, turning dark and pliable. Cottonwood shoots pushed through the damp earth, their leaves catching the wind like tiny flags of survival. Locals who had grown used to barren, lifeless channels stopped in disbelief at the sight of ponds forming where there had once been only dust. Ecologists measured the banks and found something even more stunning. The water was sinking deep into the ground, recharging hidden reserves, the very lifeblood of the desert. The beavers were not just surviving, they were working. Each gnawed log and muddy wall was creating a chain reaction. Water slowed, spread, and soaked in. The land was breathing again. What had begun as scattered patches of life soon drew attention. Ranchers noted their wells dropping less sharply. Scientists marked higher soil moisture levels. The desert, once silent and still, was stirring with possibility. These were only the first signs, but they carried a weight far beyond their size. If the beavers could hold water here, even for a season, they might hold the key to something much greater. Pools in the dust by midsummer, the desert revealed its first miracle. Where once only dust and stone stretched for miles, pools of clear water now shimmered in the sun. Behind the rough walls of beaver dams, streams slowed and spread, spilling into shallow basins that refused to dry. The sight stunned locals who had long abandoned hope of seeing water linger in those channels. Farmers leaned on fence posts, staring at ponds deep enough to reflect the sky. Children splashed in waters their parents swore would never return. To scientists, these pools meant more than novelty. They were proof. The dams were working like natural sponges, holding back floods, letting water seep into the ground, and feeding banks that had been dead for decades. The soil drank deeply, turning dark and moist. Grasses sprouted in patches, followed by the bright green of young shrubs. Dragonflies hovered above the surface, one of the first signs that new life was answering the call. For years, engineers had tried to build retention basins that cracked under the desert heat within months. Yet here, without blueprints or machines, the Beavers had achieved in weeks what humans failed to create in years. The pools in the dust carried more than water, they carried hope. Each one was a promise that the land could heal, that even a place abandoned as barren could still be coaxed back to life. And as the ponds spread, so did the belief that this gamble was no accident. The desert was listening and answering. Water that stayed in the desert. Water usually arrives like a thief, rushing in with storms and vanishing just as quickly. But now something different was happening. The ponds created by beaver dams were not fading. Weeks after the last rainfall, they still shimmered under the brutal summer heat. This was water that stayed, anchored by walls of mud and branches, pressed deep into the thirsty soil. Hydrologists measuring nearby wells were astonished. Levels that had been falling for years were rising again. Moisture sensors buried in the ground showed jumps of 20 to 30%. The desert floor, once bone dry, now pulsed with hidden reserve. Plants answered first. Cottonwoods spread their roots into softened bank, their leaves unfolding in silver-green wave. Grasses thickened, and wildflowers began to dot the edges of ponds. With the plants came insects, buzzing clouds of life drawn to nectar and water. For local ranchers, the change was undeniable. Some grazing lands grew greener than they had in a decade. One rancher, skeptical from the start, admitted that his cattle were feeding on fresh shoots he thought would never return. The miracle wasn't just in the open ponds. It was in the invisible recharge beneath. The beavers had turned fleeting rainfall into lasting storage, slowing time itself for the desert. It was the difference between life vanishing in days and life enduring for seasons. The water that stayed carried with it a truth too powerful to ignore. This wasn't temporary. The desert had found a new rhythm, written by beavers. Skeptics proven wrong from the beginning. Critics scoffed. Beavers in the desert, impossible, one hydrologist declared. Others dismissed the plan as a waste of time and resources, certain the animals would starve or flee. To them, the idea of dams holding water in dry valleys was a fantasy. But as weeks turned into months, those same doubters began to witness the undeniable. Ponds gleamed where there had been only cracked soil. Streams that once rushed away in hours now slowed and lingered. Surveys showed chain dams stretching like beads of blue across the desert floor. What had been a gamble was now hard science written in water and mud. Eliza Moreno, once one of the loudest skeptics, returned to a site only 3 weeks after the first dam was built. She admitted, "I saw changes that normally take 9 months with traditional restoration." Her words echoed the shift happening across the scientific community. Farmers who laughed at the project now pointed to wells rising again. Locals who doubted the animals would last a season now watched their children play at pond edges. The desert itself had answered the doubts with proof that could not be argued away. The critics had not just been wrong about beavers. They had underestimated nature's ability to heal itself when given the chance. Every pond, every dam, every ripple silenced the disbelief. The story was no longer about if the beavers could succeed, but about how far their success could spread. The skeptics had been proven wrong. Chains of dams appear at first. The dams were scattered, small, isolated pools tucked into dry gullies. But soon, something larger began to take shape. One pond linked to another, then another, until the desert floor was stitched together by chains of water. From the sky, aerial surveys revealed a breathtaking sight, strings of blue ponds threading across brown valleys like jewels on a necklace. Each dam slowed the flow of precious rainwater, and together, they transformed barren channels into living corridors. Sediment that once washed away in floods now settled behind the dams, cleaning the water as it seeped into the ground. Soil turned dark and rich, ready to nurture new life. Cottonwood seedlings rose from the banks, grasses spread, and wildflowers painted bursts of color across the once lifeless land. Scientists called it a natural filtration system, a process no machine could match. For locals, it was simpler. They were watching the desert heal. The chains of dams didn't just hold water, they created resilience. If one dried, another carried on. If floods came, the linked ponds absorbed the shock, spreading water instead of losing it. Each chain extended the reach of life further into places thought dead forever. The Beavers were not just building homes, they were engineering networks, blueprints of survival written across the sand. Where once a river had been erased, a living system now returned. One dam at a time, multiplied into many. The desert was no longer fractured. It was being sewn back together by chains of dams. Farmers see the shift for years. Farmers and ranchers in the Southwest had watched their wells drop lower with every season. Fields turned dusty, grazing lands shriveled, and hope seemed as dry as the soil beneath their boots. Many had laughed when they first heard about the Beaver project, dismissing it as an odd experiment for scientists with too much time. But by the summer of 2023, their doubts began to falter. One rancher reported that his well, which had been sinking steadily for a decade, had risen by a full foot since a beaver pond formed upstream. Others noticed pastures greening without the constant need for irrigation. Soil sensors confirmed what their eyes already saw. Moisture levels were climbing across the valley. The difference wasn't just in the land, it was in the livelihoods tied to it. Cattle grazed on fresh shoots, crops showed signs of resilience, and herds no longer had to wander as far for water. Farmers began to admit, sometimes reluctantly, that the animals they once considered pests were doing more for their land than years of costly machinery. At county meetings, the tone shifted. Where once voices were raised in frustration over water rights, now there were cautious nods toward cooperation. Some even called the Beavers partners, silent workers rebuilding the land dam by dam. For communities on the edge of collapse, this shift was not small, it was survival. The farmers had seen the change with their own eyes, and the credit, against all expectations, belonged to the Beavers. Birds returned to ponds. The first creatures to test the new waters were the birds. At dawn, their wings broke the silence of valleys that had known only wind for decades. Ducks paddled across ponds that just months earlier were nothing but cracked earth. Herons stalked the edges, their reflections rippling on still water. Songbirds perched in young cottonwoods, filling the desert air with calls that had not been heard in a generation. To biologists, these were not random visits. Migration specialists quickly realized the beaver ponds had revived ancient stopover points along bird routes long abandoned. The birds were not simply passing through, they were reclaiming old highways in the sky. Each pond acted like a rest stop, a safe haven where flocks could feed, drink, and regain strength before continuing their journeys. With the birds came seeds caught in feathers and droppings, spreading vegetation further along the desert floor. Every wing beat carried the promise of new life. Locals who had grown used to silence now woke to the chatter of warblers and the echo of waterfowl. For many, it was more than a sound. It was proof the desert could live again. Cameras captured scenes almost mythical, flocks circling under the sun, settling into waters carved by beavers' teeth and instinct. The return of birds meant more than beauty. It meant the ecosystem was rebuilding itself. Air, water, and land were weaving back together. The desert, once written off as barren, now sang with wings. The birds had come home to the ponds. Frogs signal recovery. If birds marked the sky's return, frogs marked the water's true rebirth. For decades, local herpetologists had believed several amphibian species were gone from the region forever. The desert was simply too harsh, too dry, too unstable to support them. But then, as ponds deepened and banks softened, their calls returned, low, resonant croaks echoing across the night. At first, it seemed impossible. Yet cameras and field surveys confirmed the truth. Breeding pairs clung to shaded shallows, and tadpoles darted through reeds. Frogs are among the most sensitive creatures in any ecosystem. They demand clean, stable water, cool enough to protect their eggs, and rich enough to feed their young. Their sudden reappearance was not just a surprise. It was a declaration. The ponds were healthy, balanced, and thriving. Ecologists measured the chemistry of the water and found it rich with insects and perfectly buffered, conditions no human-built reservoir could easily match. Locals who had grown up hearing only wind at night now spoke of a strange new chorus, frogs calling in harmony under desert stars. To many, it felt almost like folklore brought to life. Generations had told stories of animals that could summon water and life where none should exist. Now, those stories were real. The return of frogs proved that the beavers had done more than build dams. They had awakened an entire chain of survival, a signal flare in the dark that life, once thought extinct, was ready to thrive again. The desert had not just been healed, it had been reborn. Life awakens again, the silence of the desert was broken. What began with birds and frogs spread into a cascade of life. Tracks pressed into the mud told stories the eye sometimes missed. Desert foxes creeping at dawn, kangaroo rats darting along reed beds, and coyotes padding softly to drink at the water's edge. Trail cameras captured images that felt almost mythical, a family of coyotes silhouetted against a sunset pond, their muzzles dripping as they shared a fragile truce at the water. Insects hummed above the reeds, drawing swallows that looped and dived in aerial dances. Dragonflies glimmered like shards of glass, weaving over the mirrored surfaces. Fish, carried in by floods or birds, began flashing in the shallows. Even the air itself felt transformed. Microclimate stations confirmed what every visitor felt on their skin. Cooler temperatures around the ponds, enough to ease the brutal bite of summer heat and give seedlings a fighting chance. For scientists, this was proof of a living engine restarting. For locals, it was almost spiritual. Elders spoke of stories passed down from grandparents, legends of water bringers that could awaken the land. Now, those legends had to face the beaver. Life, once driven out by thirst, was returning with force. What had been a dead landscape was now alive with movement, sound, and renewal. It wasn't just an experiment anymore. It was a revolution written in paw prints, feathers, and rippling water. The desert had begun to breathe again. A global interest rises by late 2024. The story of the desert's revival had spread far beyond the valleys where it began. What started as a bold ecological gamble was now drawing attention from scientists, land managers, and governments around the world. Restoration specialists from Arizona, Utah, and New Mexico shared data with colleagues as far as northern Mexico, where parched landscapes faced the same struggles. Delegations from the Middle East visited the sites, intrigued by the possibility of using beavers as natural engineers in arid wetlands. Reports were translated into multiple languages, presented at climate conferences, and circulated among global water agencies. The idea was simple, yet radical: let wildlife, not machines, lead the fight against drought. The cost was minimal compared to dams and pipelines, and the results were self-sustaining. Every dam built by beavers meant less reliance on pumps and concrete. Every pond meant more groundwater stored for future use. Still, experts cautioned against blind enthusiasm. Beavers required woody vegetation, flowing water to begin their work, and room to build without clashing with human infrastructure. Yet even with limits, the promise was undeniable. News outlets called it a quiet revolution, and schoolchildren began drawing pictures of beavers alongside rivers in their classrooms. Farmers who once fought against wildlife now sat at meetings with conservationists, sharing ideas. Around the world, people were asking the same question: if beavers could bring life back to one of America's driest deserts, where else could they work their miracle? Politics of water rights, for all their success, the beavers stirred an ancient conflict: who owns the water? In the arid West, rivers are more than lifelines, they are power, tied to laws, permits, and rights carved in decades of court battles. When the Beavers began holding water in ponds, some worried it meant less flowing downstream. Farmers, ranchers, tribal nations, state agencies, and conservationists all found themselves at the same table, forced to ask difficult questions. Could ponds that recharged groundwater also disrupt long-established rights? Normally, such meetings bristled with anger, each side clinging tightly to every drop. But this time was different. The results were too visible to ignore. Ranchers who had once opposed the project admitted their grazing lands were greener. A farmer stood before his neighbors and described wells rising after years of decline. Schoolchildren on field trips planted cottonwood saplings, their laughter softening debates that once ended in shouting. Even long-time skeptics conceded that the Beavers were not stealing water, they were saving it. The politics of water, normally rigid and unforgiving, began to shift. Instead of endless arguments over who got the last sip, people saw the chance to create more water together. By letting nature help, it didn't erase the legal knots, but it brought something new to the table: hope. For the first time in generations, the story of water in the West was not about scarcity alone. It was about possibility, and it had been written by the paws and teeth of Beavers. History comes full circle. There was poetry in what was happening. In the 19th century, knowing logs, raising kits, and building homes that doubled as lifelines for entire valleys. The circle was complete. What was nearly lost was now restored, and what was once destroyed by human hands was being saved through human choice. The desert, healed dam by dam, was not just a tale of survival. It was a reminder that history can bend, that mistakes can be mended, and that sometimes redemption arrives in the form of small, tireless creatures. The Beavers had returned, and with them, and the rivers of the past, and the hope of the future. Predators returned. The ponds did more than bring back plants and small animals. They called the hunters home. At first, cameras captured coyotes and bobcats slipping quietly along the pond edges, drawn to the new gatherings of birds, frogs, and rodents. But then something larger appeared. A mountain lion crouched low in the reeds, its eyes glowing in the night as it watched a pair of mule deer drinking at the water's edge.